Lun Yin. He's from China, professor and director, Center for Biodiversity and Indigenous Knowledge, Southwest Forestry University. He will present the traditional knowledge of mountain ethnic groups and climate science, which is very much important for climate science section. Traditional knowledge is very much important. I'm inviting Professor Dr. Lun Yin for his nice presentation. Professor Dr. Lun Yin.
Hi, hello everyone. Hello, Dr. Hasrat. Hello, Dr. Shahidu. And it's my pleasure to do a presentation tonight here because it's nighttime in China now. So my topic today is traditional knowledge of mountain ethnic group and climate change. I will divide these three parts of my presentation. First is I will do a brief introduction, and then I will present general information, general content about traditional knowledge, biodiversity, and climate change. At the last, I will share a case study of mine in Eastern Himalaya, northwest of Yunnan province, because I'm based in Yunnan province, southwest of China. So I'm an ethno-ecologist of bi-ethnic minority background in Kunming, Yunnan province of China. I work in several agencies which focus on the climate change and the traditional knowledge, also biodiversity. My major field of research is the traditional knowledge among the indigenous people and the local community around the world, which link with biodiversity and climate change. So my work is dedicated to adaptation and resilience of climate change in support of sustainable livelihood of indigenous people and the local community. Traditional knowledge, biodiversity, and climate change. So as the Dr. Sharito present in his presentation, climate change has influenced the whole world, all the people. But climate change, especially, as a great challenge faced by the indigenous people and the local community. It makes the already disadvantaged indigenous people and the local community face greater risk and pressures. And on the other hand, traditional knowledge of indigenous people can play an important role in the process of coping with climate change. Indigenous people and the local community develop a body of traditional knowledge about the environment to ensure shelter, food, water, medicine, and the other resources are well managed. In fact, indigenous people and the local community have been using the traditional knowledge to address climate change issues for several generations. They have directly experience of environment impact of climate change. Their traditional knowledge can thus be a great help in better understanding climate change impact and identify more effective way of tracking them. Indigenous people and the local community rely on traditional knowledge to support the continuance of way of life that matter to their community. This traditional knowledge often based on environment, ecosystem, and biodiversity, and form the bond among human and nature. The reason why traditional knowledge can play an important role in process of coping with climate change is mainly because in the context of climate change, traditional knowledge is divided in two categories. The first, on the basis of long-term practice, indigenous people and the local community have formed traditional knowledge closely related to local weather and climate. Through the accumulation of experience from generation to generation, this kind of traditional knowledge can predict the upcoming weather and climate change, as well as early warning related extreme weather phenomena and disaster risks. Therefore, such traditional knowledge can mitigate the risks and impacts of climate change to a certain extent. Second, livelihood of indigenous people and the local community mainly depend on the surrounding ecosystem and natural resource, on which traditional knowledge based on the local ecosystem, especially biodiversity, is formed. Such traditional knowledge is an important means for indigenous people and the local community to use local resource and achieve sustainable survival. In the context of climate change, such traditional knowledge can effectively assist indigenous people and the local community to adapt climate change and enhance climate resilience. So what is traditional knowledge? We want to understand the relationship between traditional knowledge, biodiversity, and climate change. So traditional knowledge, also called indigenous knowledge or local knowledge, is knowledge which is accumulated and developed by people in a community based on their experience and has been validated in reality and regularly changed to adapt to nature, culture, and social environment. So the definition of traditional knowledge can be divided in three categories. The first one is the traditional knowledge in the international treaty and conventions. The concept of traditional knowledge appears in the international treaty and conventions of 3 UN agencies, namely the Convention on Biodiversity, is very well known, of UNEP, the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, and its related conventions, and the Agreement on Trade-related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, TRIPS, under the World Trade Organizations. Among these, the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, first proposed the protection and benefit sharing of traditional knowledge. According to the definition of CBD, traditional knowledge is the knowledge, innovation, and the practice developed from long-term experience and adapted to the local culture and environment. It belongs to the collective and can be passed from generation to generation in written form, but mostly in oral form. In addition to writing record, traditional knowledge can also be expressed in stories, songs, legends, proverbs, cultural values, beliefs, rituals, custom laws, and indigenous language. Traditional knowledge also includes the agricultural practice of cultivating crops and livestock varieties. Therefore, traditional knowledge for CBD is kind of practical science. CBD not only regards traditional knowledge as kind of knowledge, innovation, and the practical science, but also a kind of resource, especially a special resource related to biological resource and genetic resource. Since traditional knowledge is type of knowledge, it is bound to involve intellectual property. So the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, is the most authoritative United Nations agency dealing with the intellectual property issues in the world. WIPO established the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, traditional knowledge, and folklore in order to coordinate with CBD to deal with the issues of traditional knowledge. WIPO further defined traditional knowledge as literature, art, scientific works, performance, inventions, scientific discoveries, operating science, trademarks, enterprise names, and its sample. And utilities and unpublic data that are traditional or based on traditional, as well as all innovation and creation out of intellectual activity in industrial, scientific, literature, and art domains. The third one is WTO. In the response to the CBD, the World Trade Organization has carried out many discussions on genetic resource and traditional knowledge under TRIPS. Therefore, traditional knowledge under TRIPS is closed under CBD. Its meaning refers to traditional knowledge related to biological and genetic resources. So this is the first level traditional knowledge in the International Treaty and Convention. Second, traditional knowledge in academic research. Traditional knowledge also as indigenous knowledge or local knowledge is a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief, evolving by adaptive process and hand down through generation by cultural transmission about the relationship of living beings, including humans, with one another and with their environment. Traditional knowledge is a process rather than a content. So traditional knowledge is not stable, it's moving, it's changed, it's developed. It's kind of a way of knowing. Baker has a good first person put the traditional knowledge in the context of climate change and biodiversity. We consider that traditional knowledge is a way of knowing as well as to information. It's dynamic, building on experience and adapting to change. But the indigenous people and the local community disagree about certain definition by the international treaty and also the academic research. For the some organization and the conference of indigenous people and the local community, they have claimed that have not agreed with the definition above, especially the definition based on the Western language, such as English and the science. Climate scientists, academic policymakers may have a tendency to focus only the value of traditional knowledge as a source of data. But for the indigenous people, traditional knowledge is way of life. Traditional knowledge broadly refers to indigenous community ways of knowing that both guides and result for the community members' close relationship with and the responsibility to the landscape, waterscapes, plants, and animals that are virtual to the formation of indigenous culture. So for the indigenous people and the local community, traditional knowledge is not only a tool of data, but a culture, but a way of life. Traditional knowledge relates to climate. As I mentioned, traditional knowledge has two categories. One is climate, related to climate. Based on my work, I define the traditional knowledge related to climate as people's directly, indirectly observation and understanding of local climatological and phenological phenomena from generation to generation in a specific region, and the knowledge from on this basis to predict and deal with climate change and extreme weather phenomena. Traditional climatological knowledge is directly formed and inherited by indigenous people and the local community through long-term observation, understanding, and practice of meteorological weather and climate phenomena and their change. Traditional phonological knowledge refers to the traditional knowledge formed by indigenous people and the local community through long-term observation of nature, environment, and ecosystem, including changing livelihood conditions such as crops, livestock, farmland, etc. As CBD mentioned, traditional knowledge is linked associated with biodiversity. In the context of climate change, this kind of knowledge also can be divided as 3 levels. As you know, climate change has largely influenced the biodiversity in the world. As the biodiversity hotspot are often enriched in the cultural diversity. The indigenous people and the local community has rich traditional knowledge associated with biodiversity. This knowledge also provides analytic information about climate variability and change based on the experience and practice of biodiversity resource use. Based on my fieldwork, I divided traditional knowledge associated with biodiversity into 3 levels. The first level is traditional knowledge associated with genetic diversity. The second is traditional knowledge associated with species diversity. The third is traditional knowledge associated with ecosystem diversity. Traditional knowledge associated with genetic diversity. First, climate change is bringing new, difficult, and challenge to agriculture, certain plant genetic resource. In the future, the number of hungry people in the world will further increase, and the food security of indigenous people and the local community will become more serious. In this context, development of crop variety that are tolerant to global climate change and other environmental change often largely depend on traditional knowledge of indigenous people and the local communities. The location of indigenous people is usually in the area possessing most of the world's genetic resources. They have cultivated several varieties of agriculture and horticultural crops from local wild species, which is the basic foundation of modern plant breeding and world food security. The second is traditional knowledge associated with species diversity. Through the development of traditional livelihoods such as agriculture and pastoralism, and in the process of long-term domestication, cultivation, and breeding of plant and animal varieties, indigenous people have formed traditional knowledge associated with species diversity. Species diversity and related traditional knowledge play a fundamental role in enabling indigenous people and the local community to constant deliver of their livelihood and the food security, especially in the context of climate change. Third, traditional knowledge associated with ecosystem diversity. Indigenous people, the local community lives in different ecosystems around the world, such as forest, desert, puddle, ice fields, dryland, and watersheds, and form different traditional knowledge related to ecosystem diversity. Although some indigenous people and the local community live in the same area, because this area is contain different ecosystems, it also creates the diversity of their traditional knowledge. The traditional knowledge associated with ecosystem diversity support and maintain the local ecosystem service in varying degrees, including livelihood and the food securities. So, what's the rule about traditional knowledge in the process of coping climate change? Like the rest of the world, there are 2 main ways for indigenous people and the local community to cope with climate change. One is mitigate the impact of climate change by addressing the cause of climate change. And the other is adapt the change in the best way. For indigenous people and the local community, the traditional knowledge is the learning process and the knowledge repositories for successful response to local climate change because of their close relationship with the environment. Thus, traditional knowledge can play an important role in both approaches to cope with climate change. Traditional knowledge can provide important insights into the process of mitigation and adaptation of climate change. And there's increasing recognition of the significance of how traditional knowledge can inform the strategy for adaptation and the mitigations. Traditional knowledge and climate change mitigation. Traditional knowledge can play an important role in the climate change mitigation. As you know, climate change mitigation refers to the intervention of humans to reduce the source of or enhance the sink of greenhouse gas. For indigenous people and the local community, mitigation activities have traditionally been used as a natural resource conservation measure and ecosystem maintenance practice. And they also have dual purpose, the same as the IPCC definition of mitigation, using anthropogenic green gas and enhance the carbon sinks. And their traditional knowledge associated with biodiversity can play and will continue to play an important role in climate change mitigation through the reducing of green gas emission, increasing of carbon sinks, and the strength of carbon substitutions. Traditional knowledge can play an important role in the green gas emission reduction. The best way to mitigate climate change is by vigorously cutting down the emission of greenhouse gas. Traditional knowledge, especially those who related to ecosystem diversity, which can contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas. Compare with the traditional agriculture, for example. Modern intensive agriculture has no energy efficiency and produce more greenhouse gas emission due to its high dependence on non-renewable fossil fuels. Traditional agriculture is usually more energy efficient. In fact, in terms of agricultural output, traditional agriculture may actually be more productive than
Professor Dr. Lun Yin, please, your time is going up. Please finish it within 3 minutes.
Okay. Actually, be more. So, traditional knowledge can play an important role in the green gas emission reduction, and also traditional knowledge can play an important role in carbon sinks. As you know, indigenous people and local community has recognized the importance of forests. So the forest ecosystem can play an important role in the carbon sinks. These are well-managed forests are not providing the food for the community, but also act as the carbon sinks. Traditional knowledge and climate adaptation. For indigenous people and local community, traditional knowledge represents the dynamic information that has supported them by adapting consequently change varied climate. Traditional knowledge can play a vital role in both reducing climate vulnerability and enhance climate resilience. So for indigenous people and the local communities, traditional knowledge can reduce the vulnerability caused by the climate change, especially the traditional climatological and phonological knowledge. Based on this kind of knowledge, they have developed several adaptation methods that have enabled them to reduce their vulnerability, climate vulnerability, and extreme. Traditional knowledge and climate resilience enhancement. After Paris Agreement put forward the global adaptation goal of reducing vulnerability, enhance adaptability, and resilience. Resilience has gradually become an important concept of climate change. So traditional knowledge, especially the traditional related the plant genetic resource can play an important role to enhance its resilience. So my conclusion is, faced on challenge of climate change and extreme climate disaster, the traditional knowledge can link with the scientific knowledge first. And also we should pay attention that it's integrating the traditional knowledge into mitigation and adaptation strategies. And also we should involving the traditional knowledge in the climate policies in the different policy level. So I have a case study to show. If I have time, 5 minutes. Chair, Dr. Shahidu, if I have time to show my case.
I didn't understand it.
May I have time to show my case?
Sorry, the sound is not clear. Yeah. Can you?
May I have time to show my case?
Yeah. Your time is.
I would like to show a case about about my field work. A field.
Dear Professor, we will upload your video. Please give this link to us because your video is also 5 minutes. Hello.